All right, so just prepare yourself emotionally, because we are going to ask you when we put up things to get your thoughts on the images and issues that we're talking about. We're not going to mark down, we're not grading, but we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So Kristin, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah. Sure. My name is Kristin Bayer, and I teach at Marist College. I teach in the history department, and I teach all the classes on Asian history. And one of the upper level classes I teach is the Vietnamese War. I mean, it's really the US war in Vietnam, and I teach it from both the American and Vietnamese perspectives. So the sources that I use are not only American sources, but they're French sources, they're Vietnamese sources in translation, and I also direct the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program.
Okay, so she wears like 12 different hats. So I'm Moira Fitzgibbons. I'm in the English department, and over the past couple of years, I've been teaching a new course in the English department called Graphic Narratives. So we do graphic narratives and comics all semester. And actually, I'm honored here to say that a student in that class, Andrew, is with us. He will get out of several assignments for coming. You'll have to write a couple paragraphs, Andrew. But this is great because a lot of what I'm gonna say is based on the smart things that Andrew and other students in the class have been saying this fall, because this book was on the syllabus, okay? And just really quickly, so I'm trained as a medievalist, and so you might be like, what the heck am I doing, right? But, as you see from this medieval manuscript, medieval texts were always about images and art and words together. And I feel like our culture is now just catching up to the Middle Ages because now we're doing the same thing, and we see it in graphic novels. So you can even see on this image, that little scroll with words on it, that's called a banderole. And, in this case, the angel is announcing to the Virgin Mary, and, there's words on it, just like in a speech bubble with comics. And so this is kind of how I got sucked into it. And there's also a famous writer on comics named Scott McCloud. Anybody ever seen that book called Understanding Comics? And one of the things he does in the book is he talks about the Bayeux Tapestry, the record of the Battle of Hastings, as a kind of graphic narrative. So he's with me on this. But if I'm being 100% honest, I've just been like a comics nerd my whole life, and I love the funny papers, and I just love this stuff. So that's just sort of where I'm coming at it with this. Okay, so take it away, historian.
Okay, so this is one of the first pages that gives us an historic timeline, right? So this is right up my alley. When I do work on the Vietnam War, it stretches, earlier, and it doesn't, when I teach, it doesn't really end in 1975, right? So what I'm interested in is two things. I'm interested in how you see this timeline. Like, where do we see time expanded and given more space on the page? And where do we see less attention given to the time frame that the author is focusing on? So I think this tells us a lot about her memoir, but also about what is important to her understanding of her family's past. And I think that's key. So I'm interested, and I've got more to say, but I'm interested in how you all are seeing this. Like, what do you think is dominant in this timeline, and what's maybe either non-existent or smaller? In the back. Oh yeah, sure. Hi.
Well, it seems the numbers that are larger must be more important. 54, 63, 68. And the one on the sidebar on the left, less significant? That's my take.
Right, yeah. I mean, less significant to this story.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Anybody else have any responses to this visual of time? I mean, I love timelines, right? So this one is interesting in the way that it moves, right? It starts up all the way at the left. So 111 BC, which nowadays we say BCE, right before Common Era, to AD 938. Normally we'd say Common Era again, because even though you have Christian missionaries in French Indochina, it is not otherwise a Christian country. So to use like the birth of Christ as a marker doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we usually switch those around, but she did not, right? And so you've got a really long stretch of time that takes up a very little time frame for this author. Yes.
I noticed, all of the people shown, they're all men.
Interesting.
I mean, that's not necessarily, maybe not historically what you're asking, but that was one of the first things that popped out to me, is that those like really influential characters for her that she includes in this drawing are all male.
Right, and a complete counter to the actual story,
Yeah.
right? So, it's really interesting to bring that up when there are, first of all, she talks about gender, right, in her text, not only in understanding herself, and we'll talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah.
And you can like put the stop hand
Oh,
on me
no.
when you're going on too much. So one of the things that we see is, she talks about her relationship to her mother and her expectations of her mother, but also she talks about her role of her father in child rearing, right? So there's it's really interesting that you do have an absence of women in here when, for understanding the American War in Vietnam, gender is incredibly important, right? And we can talk a little bit more about that if we have time. The other thing that is interesting is that the French colonial rule is this little blip over there, but it overshadows all of her memoir. It overshadows all of Vietnamese history to this day. So the impact of imperialism on all countries does not get rubbed off after, in this case, subsequent wars and then liberation. But certainly globally, we still see the effects of imperialism on any colonized space. The other thing, and I think some of your comments reminded me of one of the things I wanted to say, and that is what I think is really wonderful about this narrative memoir is that it does two things that are so important to understanding history. And one is something like this timeline. And again, it's a timeline of her making, right? So like, why is 54 so prominent? Why is Ziem in 1955 a little bigger, right? Whereas, other people might be doing, emphasizing different time frames or different people. I mean, JFK, like really decorative, but kind of small. Whereas the first major escalation is under JFK's rule.
I would almost expect LBJ to be up there.
LBJ,
right?
you would think,
Yeah.
right? Right. I mean, for
From an American.
right, exactly. Going through the American school system, that would be really prominent.
Yeah.
But one of the things she does really well that I think is so good for us to remember is that there are policies and there are major historic moments and treaties and negotiations that get a lot of airspace and visual space. But the way that people experience history often does not. And I think that's something that's really interesting for us to think as we move through these slides, is the larger narrative of historical events and the really muddying of those experiences according to her family history. There's this great moment where she says something like, what is my father? Is he an anti-communist? Is he a communist? Like she's trying to fit him into historical blocks. But people's experience of everyday life, like we can think of our own, is much more blurry, right? We don't always fall into, political rhetoric, right? And I think this is a very good example of what a lot of the more recently released documents of the American War in Vietnam show, is that, people who lived in the South were not necessarily in support of the American war there. And people in the North were not necessarily capital C communists, maybe little c communists, right? Like ideologically. And so I think that this is a really good reminder, this narrative and memoir, for us to see history in both broad strokes, but also about, you know, how people live history, right?
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Where is that, the first slide? Where is that in the book? I don't ever remember seeing.
So
That's because there's too many great things in the book. And it's easy to,
unless there's an addition problem, it's right after the table of contents. But is it possible that it wasn't included in your edition?
Anything's possible.
Anything's possible.
Table of contents.
Because that's so interesting.
I have the hardcover book.
This is a soft cover. So, and this soft cover has like her almost, it's got a preface and then it's got like, do you have like where she meets the guy in the bookstore and they're talking about their experiences?
No.
I wonder if it's a little later, because
Yeah.
that's so Viet Thanh Nguyen, the person that she meets, and that is in the softcover one. I mean, he's one of the most important Vietnamese American writers today, I would argue. And you should all know his name and read everything he
Yeah,
writes.
it's like, I'm sitting here.
You're like,
talking about it like, and this is in hard drawing, and I'm thinking.
Well, it's a good thing you came.
That's a great question.
Yeah, yours have it.
When was it added? I'd be very interested to think about. With the first edition, maybe hardcover, did somebody say,
Right.
this is necessary? We
Right.
need a timeline.
Well, so because she says it's a wild year since the best we could do first came out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go
So
ahead.
maybe this is a response to feedback.
It took me a while, but I saw a snake shape up there.
Yep.
Is that a snake shape?
I couldn't tell you, but it does, you know, it does curve up and
Interesting.
around.
Ah.
That looks like the tail on the left,
Ah.
and then the head gets larger,
Ooh.
and the body a little bit too as you go along. I don't know,
Interesting.
that's
Possible.
Well, that's fascinating because I think whether or not it's an actual snake, and maybe it is, I feel like there's a lot of her aesthetic in this book that's very like sinuous and curvy and riffs on the map of Vietnam. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. So it's so true though that so many other kinds of timelines are like lines, like more angular and stuff like that. So I think that's a great point that it's like winding around and like coiling. And so I think that's a really great point that like, you know, she's maybe making a point about history, you know, being like recursive and overlapping and not linear. Yeah. So how do you make a non-linear timeline? I guess this is how.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Okay, so this is, you know, I'm speaking of what Kristin said about like the interplay between like big history and personal history. One of the things we thought we could talk about with these slides is the repetition of like maps as a motif, you know, in the book, because visually she does a lot with it. So let me just put it out there to you, like, what strikes you? Why do you think that she wants to do that? Like, you know, put the map onto sort of her, you know, to I guess that's maybe her body as a child, or, you know, just.
I'm wondering if for those of you who maybe were looking at the news during the American War in Vietnam, if any of you had the same response to that figure, if that figure is reminiscent to any of you as it is to me.
Oh, yeah.
Who? Right. I mean,
What
the
is
person who became known as Napalm Girl was the first thing I thought of. I did not include an image of that because when you actually look at the image, which is horrible, right? It's a young girl who's been burned by a napalm bombing by the Americans, running down the street with her clothes having been burned off her body. It's interesting that some of you thought the same thing because that image does not look a lot at all like this.
No.
And yet, there is something about this that, you know, triggers a memory, which I think is interesting
That's
too.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead, yeah.
The southern part of Vietnam is reversed on the chart, which suggests that somehow, in order to get that imprint, she would have to lie down on a mat.
Right. Actually, the
Or-
whole thing is reversed. right?
Is it the whole thing?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
right, yeah.
So they would, if someone else drew that map on her,
Right,
it would have been drawn the other way.
interesting.
Right. Yeah, it's
So there's a mirroring there, but it also makes you think about what, was her, like, what was the process by which that
Mhm.
scar, I mean, do you all see it as like a scar?
a burn.
Uh-huh.
Like, I get a picture that when she backs up, she's backing up into
Onto
the country and then she's
Mhm.
pulling away.
Ooh, almost like a puzzle piece kind of
That's
thing.
well, and she has left, she's pulled away from
Right,
what she was
Mhm.
going to,
right.
and now she's trying to understand it all.
That's
Right.
fascinating.
And not as a symbol of something lost, right? Like, so it's really interesting, I think, all of that language.
Right. Right. And of course, again, building on your point about the serpentine shape of the timeline, like you even see Bui doing like a curvy thing, using the map almost as a kind of visual connection between her and the child, right? So it's both a map, like a geopolitical thing, but also like an emotional thing and stuff like that. All right, here, let's keep going because I just want to make sure we like. Why don't you go, speaking of maps, let's get the story to talk. I love maps.
Okay. So what's interesting, of course, is that the way that the map appears regularly throughout the text is a unified, singular map of Vietnam, right? Whereas historically, again, we want to remember that when I turn, I think this microphone doesn't work as well. So this map on the left, Indochine, right? So this is what was called French Indochina. It included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So when she's talking in the beginning about her grandparents and the experiences of French colonial rule, especially during World War II, and she talks about the Japanese occupation and the famine. These are all sort of the afterlives of French imperialism in the region. So this is, one map that she does not really include, right? Most of the time, it's a map of an undivided Vietnam, which I think is also really interesting. That the fluidity of identity, a lot of the time, people in the United States think of North Vietnam or South Vietnam, but for the Vietnamese, that's not the case necessarily, right? Whereas you could have family from the North or from the South, it's Northern and Southern, right? The decision to demarcate the country is a global act in 1954, right? So that's, I think, really interesting and important for us to remember. And I also think it helps us to think about, again, this idea of what we understand about global decisions, political decisions, and what real everyday life is like, right? You can make the same argument of analysis for Northern and Southern Korea too, right? I mean, it's been so long now that the separation of that country really doesn't allow a lot of communication, but nobody thought of themselves as North Korean after World War II, right? That division creates a change of identity for people that is imposed upon them. And so here, you have a few of these things that are referenced early on, but to give you a sense of the country, and again, serpentine, very narrow in the middle, but here's the division, right? The global division that changes after the war.
So now I think we're going to go from like a macro view to sort of more micro views and kind of like homing in on their specific experiences. So you want to talk about this one?
Yeah. So again, I really like about this this graphic. I mean, I'm calling it a graphic narrative. It's a memoir, right? I just think she's so precise in how she places language within the illustrations. And maybe it's because she's doing both. And it's sort of fascinating. So in the beginning, right, so up there, she's talking about Vietnam still being a part of French Indochina in 1951, because after World War II, the French returned, right? And people have all these ideas, and she mentioned some of them, like, why did the French return, right? by the time of World War II, it's clear that all colonies are way too expensive to maintain, right? But for the French, after having such devastation during World War II, a lot of people argue that their identity as an empire was connected to their colonies, and therefore they insisted upon returning, right? So even though in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares independence in what's called the August Revolution, the French do reclaim Vietnam and fight to retain Vietnam against the Viet Minh until 1954. But what's interesting is here's an example of her father's grandfather being in Haiphong, which again might be familiar to some of you if you were watching the news during the American War in Vietnam, right? So on the one hand, Haiphong was an important port for the French, but it was also a focus of bombing raids, right? Rolling Thunder being one of them. And so this is one of the images of the bombing of Haiphong Harbor.
And then we're also just interested in this moment where, Bo is subject to sort of racist abuse on the street. And now we get even more micro, right? Like it's not just her family and their neighborhood, but now, they're going and they use, a slur in response to the dad, to Bo. And you can see that where he's been spat on, it's, almost he's marked with the shape of the map again, right? And one thing that came up in our class was like her use as an artist of facial expressions at different points in the story. And so how would you characterize, what do you notice about that here? Or Andrew, I don't know if you remember what we talked, I'm not putting you on the spot, you could just notice now. But like, what would you say about the faces at this very highly charged moment where, somebody's really just attacking him, and throwing this slur, not only just at him, but like in front of his own daughter, his own young daughter. So it's even more painful for that reason. How would you characterize the way she's drawn the faces in that moment?
It's embarrassment. It's disbelief.
Yeah.
It's an embarrassed to his child and self-demeaning.
Yeah. Like, where do you see the embarrassment? Like the fact that he's looking down and stuff like that?
The whole face.
Yeah, like,
And then the next segment as well.
right.
He's wiping his face off, but you can tell he's been so hurt and humiliated.
Yeah, right.
To have this child see this.
Right. And look at her face in a lot of ways. She's very explicit about how her face is responding. His face, though, it's interesting, like, I think the shame emerges not because he's like that, but it's almost in the very expressionlessness of it. Yeah, sorry, what's that?
No, it's in
him. Yeah. Like, and I wonder if like that with the map smooshed on shows really how, we tend to think of like history and maps as like external to us and like not who we really are. But then you see in a moment like this, that he almost just doesn't have like the free range to do with his body what he would want to do. Like he's got to almost shut it down a little bit. Like we notice he's relatively like expressionless and not responding. He just doesn't have the room to be like enraged at this point. And even like racist guy there, like you can even see his sort of like angry face very clearly, Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the perpetrator has a blank face. And to me, it kind of indicates that this is a whole society, not an individual who's hurting me, an individual.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, right? Like that,
especially on the right there, you mean?
Right,
yeah, that like he doesn't have like, it's almost like a silhouette, but it's not black, right? Like,
And it's not anybody, it's not an individual.
good.
It represents a group of people.
Yeah, I agree.
It represents
healing over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, interesting.
But it's real, and it's also that when he's doing an action is when he loses facial detail. Like,
Yeah.
that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Where you might want to see an expression. But also it brings up, a consistent problem in the United States, right? If the United States was fighting a war, at least supposedly, for the Vietnamese people, then why, when they're here, are they subject to attack, right? And I think you see this again and again, right? I mean, we'll probably we should be on the lookout for it as Afghan refugees come to the United States. I'm wondering, do you teach with Guy Delisle's work ever?
No.
So Guy Delisle also is a graphic. I think he's often writing nonfiction, right? His wife works with Doctors Without Borders, and so he follows her often and writes about these. So they're nonfiction, but a lot of his characters don't have a lot of facial expressions, but there are indications of emotion
Right.
outside of the real clear ones. It would be an interesting contrast.
Yeah,
I think.
no. Yeah, I feel like in class, students have been good about noticing what artists do, but then also what they choose not to do. But we hadn't discussed at all this sort of empty facelessness of that. So I think that's a great moment and one that I will borrow. I'll get your name when we're done, so I'm citing you. All right, good. Okay, so you want to talk about like the family things?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, and this is something we can revisit here and there. So one of the things I think is really interesting is that this situation would not be unusual in Vietnam and in other places around the world too, where childcare is often a shared role, right? That it really sort of it's not necessarily always that women or mothers would be the primary caregiver of children. Most of the places around the world, both parents work. The role of grandparents is usually very visible and important in child rearing. So while in some ways, I'm just wondering about how audiences read this page. In some ways, again, we see a contradiction, right? So on the one hand, he's unwilling to take this, lousy job that he thinks isn't good enough for him. And she's like, fine, I'll take it. And the roles reverse. And there's not a lot of attention to what the conversation that we might have in the United States about this, especially in the 1970s, where if a father was at home raising the kids, what would the children's social lives be like? So if any of you know anyone who, especially in academic circles, where if you've got a flexible schedule and your teaching schedule could be very flexible, then you could have a father in the 1970s doing childcare. But whether or not every kid would be allowed to come over to your house if there's only a dad home might not be the case, right? So that's one thing that's different. The other thing that I think is different and it's significant to take note of is that during the 1960s in the United States, which you have an intersection of the American women's liberation movement and the American anti-war movement coming together, Vietnamese women were considered role models for American women's liberation activists who saw in Vietnamese women who had children, but also worked and participated in a military liberation effort, right, in revolution. So, and these women are an example you see, in posters all over the United States during the anti-war movement, but also the women's liberation movement, using images of Vietnamese women as encompassing the various roles that women can do, right? Outside of class barriers and racial barriers, right? So it's interesting, again, to think about how inspiring Vietnamese women were to activist women in the United States at the time. And I think this is a good example of that too.
All right, good. So this is one of the moments where I thought it'd be interesting to think of Bui and her sort of art and decisions with other important graphic novels. And so on the left here, we have an image where Bui's talking about home as like a holding pen. And then on the right, we have an image from Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which we just were reading in class. One of the things I'll just bring up that we ended up talking a lot about in class with Bui, and it's better obviously to look at the actual book, is students had a lot of really brilliant things to say about the red wash, right, that occurs throughout the book. Like, my sense was that everybody feels like this would be, at least everybody in our class, I think, feels like this would be a really different book if it didn't have the red element in it and was just black and white, right? And when you look at Fun Home, it's a very similar combination of pen and ink with a pale wash, although in the case of Fun Home, it's blue, right? And students have had some interesting thoughts about like blue and the way that we respond to the color blue versus the way we respond to red and things like that. So that's one thing that we've talked about a lot. Also just the idea of, graphic novels being, we all know in families, right? There are things that are said and there are things that are felt but are not explicitly acknowledged, right? And one of the things that I think is so great about graphic novels is they can depict things that are true but not visible, in the conventional world, right? So, and that's, you can even, just looking quickly, if any of you read Fun Home, yeah, even just looking at it, you can tell that this is a complicated family just by virtue of the tales of those speech bubbles and how like swoopy everything is. But what about when you look, in a lot of ways, the picture that Bui has drawn and painted of her and her parents on the left is much simpler and more straightforward. But what do you think, how do you think she's visually represented the reality of her family on that page? Like, what do you notice just about the way she's decided to like depict them visually?
They're in opposite parts of the page.
Good.
Because they're not together. There's also that rug or wall hanging that's basically a line between the two of them.
Good. It almost reminds me of, in your map, there was a demilitarized zone.
Right, yeah.
So I wonder if that tapestry is almost some kind of like demilitarized zone between the two of them. Good. What else do you see in the way that she's drawn them there? What do you notice?
It looks like the mother is thinking she's accepting the situation and he's completely separate.
Okay.
They
I
have
think,
homes-
go ahead, say more.
They have separate minds.
Yeah.
And she's been trying to figure it out.
Right.
Not the mother, the daughter.
The daughter.
The
Okay.
mother is like, okay, what else is new?
The body language, right? This
Yeah.
is one thing we talk.
Judgment.
This is one thing we talk about with graphic novels, is graphic novels are almost like theater in that the language of gesture is something that's just incredibly important to the form, right? And actually I don't know about Thi Bui, we might ask her when she speaks. Alison Bechdel takes gesture and body so seriously that she and her friends will act out different scenes because she wants to make sure she gets like the anatomy and the physiology of how people would stand right. And so I think that's a great point that like, this says something, right? And even the fact that Ma is like standing up there, whereas Bo is like more in the background. Good, anything else that you see just in the way she's chosen to draw them?
The whole picture is very severe as compared to the other.
Yeah.
Very squared off as opposed to curvy. That's the right-hand picture is, I would say, softer, and that is, very rigid.
That's so true. And that is super significant given that we've already established that in a lot of other places, she draws a timeline that is all sinuous. And yet here, when it comes time to draw her family, all of a sudden everything's right angles and rigid. She could have drawn that tapestry with like a nice curvy line on it or something. But instead, even there, the sort of angularity. So that's a great point. I even, when I look at Bo's head, it almost, I joke with the students that if you read enough graphic novels, people always do so many interesting things with squares and panels and like that, like sitting in this room, I'm like, oh, look, there's a panel right there. The doorway's a panel. Like you start framing everything. And it's interesting the way that like, I mean, what is that square even doing there where his head is, right? Like she doesn't need that square. But there he is almost in his own little head panel universe. But I think you're absolutely right that like this is strikingly straight line, angular. Yeah,
Knowing what you know about the author,
right.
is this deliberate and conscious, or is it just an outflow of unconscious?
Well, you gotta ask her when she speaks.
Okay.
Because we have to find out. Yeah.
I think his head is in the box or against the box because it's hard for him as a man. His pride has been hurt. He can't find the job he's prepared for in this country.
Right.
And he's stuck in how life was, and he's hurting, clearly. Whereas mother is out there moving into modern clothes, into a different society. And of course, daughter is not quite in the box, but kind of between them.
Yeah.
My book group talked about the fact of mothers or women, as you were talking about before, the women's movement, but even from more traditional culture, the woman needs to make sure there's food on the table. And if a man can't, she's going to go out and do it. And that, I think, was very propelling for this culture.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there she is, like, she's not just thinking outside the box, she's like standing outside the box, right? Good. And as you said, you know, as the breadwinner outside the home is taking just a different role, whereas I think you're right, like, there does seem to be such a feeling of confinement. And perhaps that's like mental and emotional as much as it is anything else.
Before you go,
Yeah.
I just wanted to think about like the background,
Yes.
right? That is severe. And you know, when I look at it, I think of fire and I think of war, right? Above the tapestry is a Buddhist statue. And to the, my left, it's right, an urn, a vase, you don't really know, right? But you know, that's the past, isn't it? You know, that could be the past.
Interesting. And that's why it's all blurry back there?
But excuse me, my question is, in looking at all of this and thinking about this, are we relating to their culture? Do we know what they've lived through? Their culture is what guides them. They are what they come from. And all of a sudden, we're looking at ourselves in a whole different light. We have a whole different life here. And they have a different life as well.
Right.
So how do you, we're making a judgment on something that we feel that they're giving us. And the daughter is like this, all right, so tell me. It's a body language, you know, it's like when you fold your arms in front of you, so supposedly you say, okay, tell me what you think, give me the whole thing.
Right.
I just think we have to consider the culture that they're coming from.
Right. And that's the mom, right? The mom is standing up with the arms folded, and that's T, but I think T's looking straight at us, right? And I think that's a brilliant point that we need to remember. You know, many of us reading this book are reading it from an American perspective, the perspective maybe of people who have not been refugees and stuff like that. And that is this picture, why are they looking at us? At least T and Ma are looking at us. Bo, I feel like, is just staring into space or something. I mean, maybe, are they looking at us? And I don't know. What do you see on T's face in the middle there? How would you characterize that expression? I don't know what to call that.
Weary.
Interesting.
It's interesting because I'm not so sure she's looking at us.
Who, T?
Yeah.
Yeah, you think?
Only because I think all of these points are about the construction of this narrative, right? she is trying to find out things about her parents that she didn't know or misunderstood so she can love them better, right? That's what she says in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
But the author knows who her audience is. We're her audience, right? So she's giving this to us in some ways, knowing our positionality. It's not as though this is, sometimes you can read or have graphic novels, whatever, that could be in English and another language at the same time. Not this one. So the author knows the audience. I think she knows who's going to
It's
end
not
up
written
reading
in
it.
Vietnamese,
Right.
right? That'd be a
But
whole different book.
But T doesn't even get it, right? Like she doesn't understand.
I think it's like a conundrum, her father had these experiences and has not shared. Her mother has her experiences, has not shared, and her conundrum is how to get to them to get the story out, because this is fairly early on in the book. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, beginning of chapter 3.
Right.
Yeah.
I think uncertainty is what I read on her face.
Yeah.
And she says, my parents have been separated since I was 19.
Right.
They remained friends. Huh?
Yeah. Right.
What is that about?
Right.
And it-
Right. So there's even, on top of all of this, like the cultural divide and the experiential divide, there's just their marriage, right? Which, that's like a whole nother thing, right? All right, cool. So I just had to include this image. Maybe I'll talk about how this class,
for
and
sure.
then you can talk about the broader thing. So when I taught this book, I was worried because, she just goes there with the childbirth right away. And I'm like, whoa. But I don't know. My sense was that the students almost liked just plunging into her perspective like that. Do you think that that's true? Like it didn't feel, you don't feel detached. I mean, so she just goes there, and students just had really interesting things to say about how in this moment of crisis, how Bui is moving back and forth in terms of point of view, that we're inside her head there, all of a sudden we see her externally there, then we get the overview, and then we're in this kind of like psychedelic space where the baby emerges, and obviously some interesting things happening with panel. We're certainly not in our linear straight world there, right? We're like super curvy. So do you want to talk about like the whole childbirth historical resonance of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, I think, actually. Like, and if we think about positionality, this is off the top of my head. This is not what I was going to say. But look at her mom, right?
Yeah.
Because that's another part of the story, right? Is that, the things she doesn't understand about her mother's experiences really sort of come to light at her own labor, right? Because her mother can't be in the room with her. And I think it's really interesting how that becomes an avenue to get at her mother's history, right? Because her mother has had all of this trauma of losing children, right? But the other thing that struck me as soon as I saw this page is that this is such a common, dominant part of historical narrative representations of independence and revolution, right? So you see this all the time. So, my specialty is Asia, and when you watch films about revolution or novels, you read novels about revolution or independence movements, they so frequently put a birth at the beginning, at the most important point in the middle, to think about like a new nation usually, right? There's a very famous film, it's not very easy to see, called City of Sadness by a filmmaker named Ho Hao-shin, who's Taiwanese. And that it starts out by, you don't see anything, you only hear it. And while you're hearing a birthing happen, the news is talking about the liberation of Taiwan from Japanese occupation. So it's very interesting that you see this again and again historically. And for me, so I'm thinking about that, right? About the major importance of going back to that timeline. 1975, she refers to as liberation, which is what, for the most part, you would hear in Vietnam, no matter where people are from, right? It gets conflicted for people who end up leaving the country. But that sort of reminds me of that moment as well. but also that this is the entree into getting at her mother's experiences, right? She sees a whole nother version of her mother through this event, right? Where her mother cannot be with her, and her mother's trepidation, right? So it's a completely different person than we've seen so far, where her mother is definitive and takes on the new roles, and is very, I don't want to use the word cagey because it's got this negative connotation, but she's not opening up to her daughter to talk about her past. But interestingly enough, she talks to her son-in-law about things,
In
right?
the car.
In the car, of course.
God, love the car.
Captive audience,
Car
right?
talk, that's where it happened. Anybody want to say anything else about this 2-page spread before we move on? Yeah.
I knew that there was gonna be, the birth was a big thing at the beginning, before I read the book.
Yeah.
But I have to say that was so minimalist to me. The mother I focused in on because it was just like, well, why is she reacting that way? I mean, why is it she's made this trip and yet she's hiding from it?
That's so funny. So that's really for you. And actually visually, she's put the mother's freaked out sort of body and stance at a pretty central point in the 2-page spread, right? So, and it's actually one of the lighter points. So I think there, that may be a reason. Maybe Bui was almost guiding us to actually look at the small picture. I mean, honestly, it's like total opposites, right? Like Bui's just out there giving birth, right? Whereas the mom, her, again, with the body
It
language
made me want to know more.
made you want to know more.
Oh,
Interesting.
great.
All right, cool. Any other, this is one of the reddest reds that we get in the book too, the sort of hospital gown that she's wearing. All right. I just wanted to bring this up. I don't know, has any of you ever read the John Lewis and Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell series March? It's a series of 3 graphic novels documenting Lewis's journey from sort of farm boy to civil rights activist, and especially like the Freedom Rides and the March on Selma in the 1960s. Brilliant, brilliant series of graphic novels. And we were just talking about in class, if we wanted to think about this as almost like a trauma moment too, just like physical trauma, this is where Lewis has gotten his head beaten in the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And he's kind of thinking he's gonna die, and then he kind of hears this voice, get up. And so it's always interesting to see a graphic artist depicting a mental state that's like extremely liminal and your brain's just not all there and things like that. Same kind of like billowy, curvy visuals. Okay, I also just wanted to bring this up and talk about a technical aspect of graphic novels that it's always good to keep your eye out for, which is people who read a lot of graphic novels. Have you ever heard the discussion of the gutter? Mm-hmm. I'm now going to bring our discussion into the gutter. Okay. And the white space between panels and what happens in that situation is often something that I think artists and writers and readers are all very aware of. And so in class, a student in our class, Skylar Ransom, who said I could mention her name and talk about her idea, she noticed, first of all, how Beau's cigarette smoke is doing such interesting work in those panels. Almost to show, they're in separate spaces, but that the smoke is kind of connecting them. And you'll notice how the smoke almost becomes a separate windy, actually, now that we're talking about it. Usually gutters are straight, right? But this one is almost like a windy one that we could think of as both connecting them and separating them. And then she also brought up, we had read the book American Born Chinese by Jean Lewin Yang. Really brilliant book, directed more toward maybe middle school readers, but I think interesting for everyone. And just this is a scene where 2 key characters are reuniting and talking. And you can see that as the cigarette smoke diminishes, the 2 characters are actually recovering their friendship and becoming closer. So just seeing, there's really interesting things in Art Spiegelman's Mouse as well with cigarettes that are the characters smoking. And I just really liked this student's awareness of the smoke as being almost like an alternative sort of horizontal gutter Whereas, you've got the vertical gutters separating the panels. So here, since we don't have that much time, we'll just move on. Also, Kristin and I thought it was important to think about, just the purpose of this book. And I was wondering, we thought maybe we could talk about the moment where she includes actual straight up photos as opposed to illustrations. And I just have here an astonishing moment in Mouse where, Vladek, the father, not only gets his portrait taken, but gets his portrait taken in a concentration camp uniform. And I mean, I don't know how you want to read that face, but he is saying something in that face. So, maybe we could talk about this book as a kind of historical document?
I think that's what's so interesting whenever they do this, right? I mean, it happens, this is a terrible thing. Before we finish, I will remember the author's name. It just came pop into my head. But whenever you have an imposition of documents, I think it really ties things together. Even if it's a novel, right? It brings you into reality, and for me as an historian, the articles of the past to keep us connected that way, right? So I think this is an amazing use of document, right? It brings everything together where, we were now boat people. And again, this is generational information, right? So not everybody knows that term boat people anymore, right? But then you don't only see their pictures, it names the boat they were on, right? I mean, the label of being a boat person is right there in their identification pictures. So for me, I mean, this makes something that is graphic into an historical document as well. Not only the fact that it's her memoir, right? It's a primary source for us in that way. I mean, this is a visual primary source as well.
How did those photos affect you when you saw them? Or how do they affect you now as you look at
Our
them?
book group everybody agreed they were glad that they were inserted, that it was nice to have the reality mixed in with the artistic aspect of it.
Just as an anchor almost? Or,
I remember the book I was thinking of.
what was it?
Sebald's The Immigrants. Do you know that book?
No?
And so, it's the same idea of doing historical fiction, or there's all these interesting words now to describe nonfiction that has fiction in it, right? Exactly, all of these things. And in his text called The Immigrants, he's a novelist, but he writes a lot about his own personal past, influenced through World War II. And in the one called The Immigrants, there are his own photographs in there. Sometimes of a scene, right? Like a landscape, but it really makes you engage with the text differently. I think it really brings you in and out of the present and into the past in different ways.
Okay, so we thought we'd end with this image just because it's so beautiful. Students had some interesting things to say. I never would have thought this way. I was thinking of this only as a 2-page spread, so all is one unit. But when we talked about it in class, one student brought up that on the left, it's very static. And then on the right page is full of movement, And so I never would have noticed that. And I don't know if you have thoughts about this or how this particular page affects your understanding of being kind of, immersed in this book.
What is it supposed to be on the right? Is it a building or a boat?
It's a boat.
It's a little boat, but I think the fact that you can't tell is important. Because I think there was probably a different way you could have illustrated this, that the boat in the distance is big glowy boat, you know what I mean? Boat on the horizon that's gonna solve everything.
And also the movement.
Exactly, and instead she's made that boat barely visible, right?
It's a part of the sea,
Yeah,
right? It doesn't seem separate from the sea, right?
Exactly.
It's just a drift.
Adrift, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the sky is so different from, there's some vibrancy on the right.
Yes.
And this is Beau,
Right.
a very different person than we come to see as the person she grew up with in the United States, right? Am I remembering correctly? He ends up getting called to pilot the boat, right? I mean, a totally active person
Yes.
who, really gets subsumed by his new environment in the US.
Yeah, like think about the expression on that face
Yeah.
for her dad. Whoops. Versus
That's a fun
right
one.
there. That's a whole
That's a good
different,
comparison.
whole
yeah.
different kind of face right there. So again, like I don't know. I mean, to me, graphic novels as a form lend themselves particularly well to discussions, like honestly to like collaborative reading. Like I'm always like, oh, I have this all prepped for class, and then I walk into our class and students are like, boop, 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 like saying these things that I never would have thought of, and now we've all shared perspectives that will give us new ways of thinking about it. So I almost think this was like just like a perfect book for a big read because it's just so accessible. We all see different things, right?
Yeah, and we get to see it together.
Yeah.
It's like watching a movie together with people and hearing them respond or listening to them afterwards. We're all looking at it. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but we're informed by our experiences or our understandings of the past or her narrative that allows us to legitimately read the image, right? Like just like you would read a book, right?
So I guess we'll just end there.
Yeah.
But thank you all.
Thank you so much.
I love that person.